Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the museum for our Chats on the Past program, where we discuss history with authors, scholars, historians, and artisans. My name, as always, is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Programs and Collections Director for the Westport Museum for History and Culture. As we begin all of our programs, the museum would like to recognize and honor the Paugussett people, who are the indigenous communities native to this region. We would also like to recognize and acknowledge that the Westport Museum and the town of Westport were built with and on unceded Indigenous homelands. Tonight, we are very pleased to offer you this program free of charge, but we do, as always, have a suggested donation of $5 for any of our free programming to support this in the future. We ask that you donate however you are able, and if you can't make a monetary donation at this time, we understand. And we do ask that you support the museum by following us and liking us on social media. On Facebook and Twitter, you can follow us at Westport History, and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. This will also notify you of any of our free online programs in the future. If you would like to view any of our previously recorded live programs, you can follow us on Facebook, or you can view any of those recordings on YouTube just by searching the name of the museum. If at any time tonight during our program you have a comment, a question, or an anecdote that you would like to share, please enter it in the comments box, and I or my speaker tonight will go through as many of those as we can at the end of our discussion. This evening, we are joined by Charles Brilvitch, who was born and raised in Bridgeport. He studied at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, where he worked on the restoration of houses in that city's historic Ohio City neighborhood. He served as executive director at nonprofit housing agencies in both Bridgeport and New York City. Named city historian in 1990, he prepared the National Register nominations for hundreds of city buildings and created 5 local historic districts. He became historian for the Golden Hill Paugussett tribe in 2003 and authored their petition for federal recognition. In doing so, he discovered a lost chapter in the tribe's history, a 19th century urban community in Bridgeport's South End where tribal members were full participants in the city's ascendancy as a major industrial and commercial center. So welcome, Charles.
Thank you for having me, Nicole.
Of course, we are so pleased to have you. So I'd like to start our discussion with my very first question of what led you to become the official historian for the Paugussett tribe people? And also, do you belong to the tribe?
No, I'm not a member of the tribe. Don't have a drop of Indian blood in me, so far as I know. I was a city historian, and Paugussett tribe began their quest for federal recognition back in 1982. The federal government requires that a tribe be able to account for pretty much every year from time of first contact to the present. They have to be able to demonstrate that there is tribal activity, that there is political leadership in place. And this has to be done at least once a decade for every year from, in the case of the Paugussets, from 1637, the time of the Pequot War, to the present day. And they had, for a while, a number of historians who were able to trace everything through the 18th century with no problem, into the first years of the 19th century, and then the tribe kind of disappears. All the local histories say that the tribe melted away before the white man, and I was never quite sure what that meant. You know, I'm just picturing people disappearing into thin air or something. But in the year 1886, Orchid's History of Stratford and Bridgeport is published, and there's a an Indian by the name of William Sherman, who is spotlighted. He's called the chief of the tribe and talks about all the traditions of the tribe. And he's the guy who revived the Golden Hill Paugussett Reservation as it exists today. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs said, okay, your last record of the tribe is either in 1802 or 1821. And what's going on between then and 1886? And for the longest time, historians were unable to find that. And I was able to, through kind of a quirk in my historic research, I was able to fill in that whole chapter and show that the tribe was indeed vibrant and acting exactly as a textbook says they had to have behaved, with political leadership and tribal activities and all kinds of stuff going on. And what that was, there were a couple of houses in the south end of Bridgeport, the Mary and Eliza Freeman houses. And these houses were built by two women of color in the year 1848. And I put those on the National Register of Historic Places. And in city directories, they were called colored. In census records, they were called mulatto. And I politically correctified that, if that's a word, to African American. And I knew that they were part of this community in the south end of Bridgeport of people of color. I knew that they had a brother by the name of Joel Freeman, who was in a leadership position, as you could tell from all the public records. Whenever there's a marriage in the community, he's one of the witnesses, legal witnesses. Whenever there's a death in the community, he's usually executor of the estate. He was the founder of the church in the community, one of the three first trustees. His name was Joel Freeman. And I'm going through all the Indian deeds when I started working for the tribe in 2003, and there's like literally tens of thousands of photocopies of every document relating to the tribe. And on one, I find a deed for a sale of land in Beaver Hills in New Haven by the Turkey Hill Indians. And the 7 surviving members of the Turkey Hill tribe signed their names. And one of the signatures was Joel Freeman. And I thought, I know who Joel Freeman is if it's the same guy. And went to the census records and found there was only one individual in the whole state of Connecticut by the name of Joel Freeman. His name was George or Samuel or something. It would have been a different story. But here was the thread that led me to connect the tribe to the community in the south end of Bridgeport, the community we know now as Little Liberia. So that led to a whole lot of other ties. William Sherman, the Indian written up in the 1886 history, left a diary, and his diary is basically a work log. And every other historian looked at that and said, oh, went and plowed the back 40 today and hauled hay and did this, did that. And they said, this whole thing is absolutely worthless to us. But knowing who the people were in the south end of Bridgeport, he writes, went to see Davis, and the next day there's a clam bake that his boss in Trumbull is having. And William H. Davis was a clam dealer in the Little Liberia community. So being able to put that whole story together was really a lot of fun to research, and came up with the whole story of the tribe and its connection to the Little Liberia community, and the fact that many of the people who lived in that community were actually Paugussett Indians. There were others who were Indians from Long Island, the Hudson Valley of New York, and all kinds of interesting and remarkable things going on.
It's amazing the resources you were able to find, especially that they had been overlooked in the past. It's amazing the resources.
Yeah, and the fact that every history of Fairfield County, Bridgeport, whatever, had completely neglected all of this. They did Indian history that usually goes up to maybe 1760 or so, and then it just trails off to nothing and becomes the story of the white community exclusively.
Right. Now, since we're talking about the 18th century, would you tell us a little bit more about the Paugussett people and their status in the region prior or just prior to this this drop-off point in the 1700s, or excuse me, in the 1600s and the 1700s? What was life like for them just prior to European contact?
We know from a number of sources that the population around the shores of Long Island Sound was almost certainly the densest of any Indian population in what's now the United States. The resources were all there, plenty of waterfowl and particularly shellfish. And it was a place where you could just wade out into the water and in 5 minutes secure a nice dinner. There were plenty of lobsters crawling around. There were oysters all over the place. And then, as now, the mouth of the Housatonic River had about 25% of the oyster population of all of Long Island Sound. So this was a densely populated place. There were a couple of amateur archaeologists who wrote an article in 1941. And these were the kinds of guys where if you were digging a foundation and found some pottery or bones or whatever, these are the guys you called in. So they were able to tell as the city grew and the suburbs grew where all the communities were located, where the camp locations were located, where the burial grounds were located. And they found something like 11 village locations just within the city of Bridgeport.
Wow.
There were a number of others in Fairfield and Westport and Stratford. Inland was, to a lesser extent, a permanent place of settlement. We know that there were permanent settlements in what's now Newtown and Southbury, and another further north on the Housatonic River in the town of New Milford. But aside from that, it was basically hunting grounds, and everybody would gather at the shores of Long Island Sound for the summer months, and they would dry clams and oysters for winter use. They had a lot of cleared land. The word Pequonic, which was the original name for Bridgeport, and also the name of the river flowing through the city, means cleared land in the Caripi language. So we know there was a lot of land that they had cleared. We know there was in the west end of Bridgeport and over the town line into Fairfield was the great Indian planting field that was written about in the 17th century. It was over 100 acres in size. And when you think of the size of trees in a virgin forest, you know, oak trees with trunks 4 inches in diameter, the thought of cutting one of those trees down with stone tools and fire was a pretty daunting task. And the fact that they were able to do that, and I saw a figure, there's something like an average of 900 trees on an acre of land in a virgin or an old growth forest. So 900 big trees being removed to clear 1 acre of ground, and this was 100 acres in size. Quite an amazing amount of work over many, many generations. And there are fields like this in Westport, in Fairfield, and in Stratford as well. So at the time of the Pequot War, there were soldiers that came from the Connecticut River Valley, which had been settled only a few years before, and also a lot from Massachusetts. And as they were pursuing the Pequot tribal members and leadership from their homeland west along the Connecticut shoreline, they came across this particular geological province of the state of Connecticut in between New Haven and Westport, where it's a whole different type of land geologically. If you stick a shovel in the ground from Norwalk west or from East Haven east, you're going to hit a rock immediately. There's a lot of ledge, there's a lot of swamp. But between New Haven and Westport, the land was different. The soil was very good, very fertile, very little in the way of ledge and stone, so perfect for farming. And the combatants in the Pequot War saw this land and made a mental note: this is a place we want to come back and secure for ourselves. There was, however, a very large native population. Paugussett tribe was probably between 5,000 and 10,000 people. So at a very early time, they had to make accommodations for this tribe if they wanted to settle the land. And Stratford and Fairfield, which were much bigger than they are today in area, were both settled in that year of 1639. And there were a lot of Indians in between the two towns. So they came up with a very unusual at the time concept that no one had thought of before, and that was the Indian reservation. So they set aside what was called Golden Hill, which was the site of the main Paugussett village just above downtown Bridgeport, and set this aside as the first reservation in that year of 1639. There were other reservations set aside. There was Mashamooks in Westport, what's now the center of Green's Farms. There was another at Rose Hill in Southport. There were others in what's now Shelton, Milford, and going up the Housatonic Valley in Derby and other towns of that area. But these first reservations were mostly along the coast. And for a time, there was a somewhat harmonious relationship between the whites and the natives. They traded. Long Island Sound was a place that was just rife with quahog clams, and these became valuable in the fur trade because they were used for wampum. Wampum was something that had a ceremonial use, traditional among tribes all over the eastern United States. And it was made out of clamshells interwoven between the white section of the clamshell on the inside and the purple section. And ceremonial use, religious use, and diplomatic use were what they were used for and valued as. And the Dutch turned them into currency. They would pay for furs coming into Albany from the Adirondacks of New York and southern, what we know as southern Canada, with wampum belts. So the Paugussets were prospering for a time with the Dutch making these wampum belts as currency. Things began to sour at the time of King Philip's War. The Paugussets did not participate in the war, had nothing to do with it, but after the whites defeated the Indians, I think the year was 1677, things turned sour rapidly for the Paugussets, and we see one after another of these reservations terminated until only Golden Hill was left. 1681, that great Indian planting field, place where the sachem or sagamore resided on the Rooster River. You can still see it on the backside of Mountain Grove Cemetery, was taken from the tribe. And only the reservation of Golden Hill was left. And that reservation just started to get whittled away. In 1763, the Indians petitioned to the colony of Connecticut that 63 out of their 80 remaining acres had been taken away. And the white people who had taken it were letting their hogs graze in the Indians' cornfield, and they were about to starve to death because everything they had was being taken from them. And as I put in my book, the colony in Hartford responded basically, that's the way the cookie crumbles. So now you've got a much smaller reservation. And by 1802, it was down to only 12 acres. There was a white guy who went to the defense of the Indians and spoke on their behalf up in Hartford. And the state, when it became a state in the 1780s, said we're going to institute a policy of having overseers for our Indian tribes. And these overseers will manage their affairs and take care of them as though they are, children, manage their finances, and make sure that their land stays intact. And what this overseer did after a couple of years was said, okay, the tribe owes me $200 for my services, so we're going to have to sell this 12 acres of land to pay my expenses. So in 1802, the last of the Paugussett lands in Bridgeport was sold off, and all that money went to the overseer, and the tribe became landless. There were other overseers appointed. Being a tribal overseer was kind of a plum position for a well-connected lawyer to have. Didn't have to do very much. The Indians weren't going to complain, and if they did, no one would listen. And you'd always pocket some pretty nice fees for doing this job. There was one overseer who was a little bit more conscientious than the others. And in 1841, he said, this tribe is landless. We've got to do something for them. So he purchased 19 3/4 acres of land in the Nichols section of Trumbull, reestablished the reservation, and kind of went off and left the position vacant. So the state filled it with someone else who decided 9 years later, the tribe isn't managing this land well. It's time to sell it off and pay my expenses. So that 19.5 acres called the Turkey Meadows Reservation was sold off. And tribe kind of was working, as I mentioned, most of them moved to the south end of Bridgeport. They became involved in the mainstream economy, as did everyone else. They were very involved in seafaring trades. The women became involved with the laundry trade. They were very, very well-respected culinary experts. And to have a native woman as a cook in your household was considered one of the greatest prizes that you could secure. P.T. Barnum had a woman by the name of Presence Jackson as the cook in his household, and she was likely a either Paugussett or Mohican woman. She came from Putnam County in New York and lived in the South End community. Lots of other women were steamboat cooks on the steamboats that were plying the waters of Long Island Sound as well as the Hudson River. So anyway, you asked me to fill in that up to the 1760s. I went a tad beyond that.
That's fascinating. It's I'd like to say unbelievable, but unfortunately we know from other history that unfortunately Native peoples were forced onto these reservations and very often lost these reservations in other places in the United States, and it's sad and unfortunate to know that it happened here in Connecticut as well.
Well, it's sad, and at the same time, good things happened out of the limelight. There was a really good article published in the Bridgeport Sunday Post in 1928. It talked about the birth of the AME Zion Church in Bridgeport 100 years earlier. And it said that a man, they didn't mention his name, went around to all the rural towns surrounding Bridgeport and said that there were typically 1 or 2 or 3 families living in isolation, families of color, and just got them all together and said, next Sunday, we're going to meet in downtown Bridgeport under the great elm tree and have divine service. And we're going to set up our own church. So got all these isolated families, you know, a couple families from Newtown, a couple from Reading, a couple from Weston, and got them all together in one place. And that was kind of the birth of the Little Liberia community and the church that brought it all together. And people started thinking, instead of, you know, working as an itinerant farmhand and maybe having a little shack out in the woods, maybe it's a better idea to move to the city and get a better line of work and, you know, join society.
Yeah.
And the Bureau of Indian Affairs has this mentality of, you've got to show Indian tribes living out in the woods and weaving baskets and dancing around campfires, and this whole thing of, you know, they're getting involved with real estate development and opening businesses and whatever. It's hard to justify that as tribal activity. But that's exactly what they did. We know that Mary and Eliza Freeman were living with their parents in the north end of Derby until their parents died. At that point, they went to New York City. We know that Mary became chef in New York City hotels and started to amass a fortune. And by the time Mary Freeman died in 1883, she was the second wealthiest person in Bridgeport. Only P.T. Barnum had more money. And more than any of the factory owners or the people building great mansions. So remarkable story. And she was not alone in that community. There were other people. The largest restaurant in downtown Bridgeport was owned by a woman of color from that community. And
Charles, can you tell us more about what Little Liberia and what this community of Paugussett and other Native peoples really looked like? What kind of power did they have in Bridgeport? Because you tell us that they're very, very active. What are these individuals and also the tribe able to do in this period with this thriving community?
Well, in a way, they were, you know, discriminated against. Mary Freeman, with all her money, couldn't go to Golden Hill or Seaside Park or Washington Park, where the well-to-do lived, and build a big mansion there. That just was not in the realm of possibility. This was the community where they were relegated to. But by the same token, they were not going to shrug their shoulders and say, oh, we're downtrodden, we can't do anything about this. And they took the bull by the horns and just lived very productive and amazing lives. As I said, Mary Freeman did amazing things with finances, with real estate development, building houses, renting them out, bankrolling other people, loaning out mortgage monies because there were no banks that would do so. And she was a chef in New York City hotels. And then there's a guy from New York City, a very well-to-do African-American, who comes to Bridgeport and right next door to Mary's sister Eliza builds a 5-story resort hotel for well-to-do people of color. And this is, before the Civil War.
Mhm.
And I kind of saw this through public documents, and I thought it almost looks like a luxury hotel for Black people, but of course, there was no such thing. And then someone found a letter written to Frederick Douglass the year after the hotel opened, describing the hotel, and that's exactly what it was, a luxury oceanfront hotel. So it was a pretty amazing thing. The letter to Frederick Douglass, they're describing the Grand Salon, and there's the Duke of Haiti playing the grand piano, and the fountain out in front kind of acting as an air conditioner for the whole building, and what the whole community looked like. Everyone taking pride in their homes, and everyone's out there watering their flower beds in the evening and keeping everything just beautifully trimmed, and keeps talking about how refreshing the air smelled. He was from Brooklyn, so maybe he wasn't used to that. But, the hum of the insects, and how Bridgeport was the ideal place for the Black summer resort for the people of color to have their equivalent to Newport and Saratoga. So it's kind of odd. This building had to have been one of the biggest buildings in the whole city of Bridgeport at the time. And there's no mention of it in the newspaper. There's no mention of it in any of the local histories. So that was...
Wow. That's amazing. It's amazing that it existed at all. It sounds fabulous.
Yeah.
I wish we could visit today.
And that letter was so amazing. There's a guy I see in lots of records named George Francis, and it turns out his name is Georges Francois, and he's the nephew of the Emperor of Haiti.
Wow.
And he's the guy playing Mozart on the grand piano in the salon of the hotel. So hard to imagine, but one of the amazing things about this community in Bridgeport.
It's fabulous. I am very excited about the recent developments with the Freeman Center, along with for the Freeman sisters. But the extent of the neighborhood is just continuously astounds, and it's just fabulous to hear more and more about them.
Yeah, I'd love to see the whole thing reconstructed as like a colonial Williamsburg. I know that will never happen, but sure do picture it in my mind. And, all the various people that were involved with it, and people coming from everywhere, people coming over from Long Island and down from the Hudson Valley, and from, I drew a map once of where everybody lived and drew a line, and it looked like a big starburst. They're coming from all over the place to Bridgeport. And this was a community that was widely known all over the northeastern United States. And it was a pioneering community that others that came later were modeled after. Remarkable things going on there, and nobody knew. And it's all part of this tribal history.
Now, Charles, moving forward in time, in 2003, you authored the petition for federal recognition. I wondered if you would tell our audience a little bit more about what that process means for tribal people, but also what it meant for the Paugussett tribe, and then also what the ultimate result of that petition was.
Okay, this was the second petition. There was one that was turned down in the 1990s, and the tribe had hired other historians, And I was able to figure out that they had gone to various archives and said, give us everything you have on the Golden Hill Paugussett tribe. And they didn't really think out of the box and look for things that weren't labeled Golden Hill Paugussett tribe as I needed to do to put the whole thing together. So anyway, there was a whole big period that they could account for no tribal activity. And the historians would say, well, the state continually recognized the tribe, so there must have been some entity there to recognize. And that kind of didn't cut it with the Bureau of Indian Affairs. So I did the second petition, and it was like I couldn't have invented a better scenario. This whole thing tied together so perfectly. Joel Freeman, he's functioning as a leader. He's doing everything. And you have to be able to cite all these things documented by a disinterested third-party source. So it can't be a tribal member saying this is going on. It's got to be some person outside of the community. And Joel Freeman, everything he did, starting the church, doing all this thing for tribal members, starting a free public lending library, starting a Masonic lodge, and documenting how that lodge functioned. There was like no police protection in this community. It was like completely separate, and the city of Bridgeport at large wanted no part of it. So the community basically had to police itself, and the Masonic Lodge took on that task for the benefit of everyone who lived there. And, you know, everything just fit together so well. And it came back that this petition was turned down, and they said, we have documentation that shows that these people were not Native Americans, they were African Americans. And this is from the Library of Congress. And I learned that the documentation that they were citing was my National Register report for the Mary and Eliza Freeman houses, where I had politically correctified colored to African American. So they had to have known that I would realize the ridiculousness of them using my work based on, you know, a couple weeks research to refute all my research based on a year and a half of research that showed that they were Native Americans. So it got turned down, and you just have a situation. Chief Quiet Hawk, before he died just a couple weeks back, said he came to the realization that it was all about money, and that was the only thing that mattered. You had 5 tribes recognized by the state of Connecticut going back to colonial times. No tribe was in any way more legitimate than any of the others. And you had 2 of them that got federal recognition, built huge casino facilities, made billions of dollars, and the remaining tribes just basically got shut out of the whole picture. And we had like the senior senator of the state of Connecticut referring to the Paugussets as these so-called Indians, and making other very disparaging statements of that nature. So, you know, it got turned down. I think that was an outrage. And then the federal government decided they're going to change the criteria for federal recognition and make it a lot more reasonable. A tribe only had to prove continued existence back to 1900. And the way it was, overseers were responsible for keeping records. If they were too lazy to keep the records, or had them in a shoebox someplace and they disappeared, well, then the tribe was just out of luck. Going back to 1900, there's a much, much better trail. You can account for pretty much everything. So that was a lot more reasonable. And they also said that any tribe that had a reservation going back to the year 1900, that would count as evidence that the tribe existed back to that date. Beginning about 1900, there was a great deal of interest in the public at large that there are Indian tribes living here in Connecticut, right in our midst. And the Sunday newspapers would do all these articles describing the traditions that the tribe had, the privileges they had for being Indians. They didn't have to get dog licenses or hunting licenses. They could go fishing out of season, whatever. And just, remarkable things. And they would interview these people as, very interesting parts of our community. So all the stuff is there. And the Connecticut congressional delegation said, we want a clause tacked on to this saying that any tribe needs the permission of people who had filed as interested parties in order to reapply or in order to apply for federal recognition. And in Connecticut, that meant the governor and the congressional delegation. And I said that that was the equivalent of the Ku Klux Klan needing to give the approval for the Civil Rights Act. So that kind of got laughed out of existence. But they tacked on another thing called the Connecticut Clause, which said that any tribe that applied previously under the old criteria was ineligible to apply under the new criteria. So the tribe continues to be locked out of, something they would absolutely certainly qualify for. And, we will see where this goes. That it would seem to me that this is patently illegal and unconstitutional. That, it's like saying when the Gay Marriage Act became law, that anyone who had tried to get married before that was ineligible and had to stay single their whole lives. That's not the way this country is supposed to work.
Right. Now, today, we know that the Golden Hill Paugussett reservation still exists in Trumbull, albeit very significantly whittled down in size.
Smallest reservation in America, 1/4 of an acre.
Yeah. Now, what is the current status of the tribe in southern Connecticut today with this reservation? We, of course, know that they don't have federal recognition. But what else can you tell us about their situation today?
Well, they have been continually recognized by the colony and state of Connecticut going back to that year of 1639. The state is responsible for the reservation. At times during history, they just completely ignored it. It's a property that's not, on the tax rolls of the town. They don't pay, property taxes. They have a lot of rights as Native Americans that average citizens do not have. Like I said, with the dog licenses and fishing licenses and so on, not a major thing. There was an old house on the reservation that William Sherman built in 1875. He borrowed money from the tribal fund, built a house that was, I don't think it ever had any indoor plumbing. And by the 1970s, it was ready to cave in. So there was a lot of controversy. The state wanted to tear down the house and supposedly give the tribe some surplus property that they had acquired when they were building the Route 25 expressway or something. And Chief Big Eagle at the time, he was internationally known Indian rights activist and chief of the Golden Hill Paugussett tribe. He was determined that nobody was going to take that reservation away. So when the state tore the house down, he was living in a teepee heated by a fire, an open fire. And he was an elderly man with a bad heart condition, but sleeping on the dirt floor, determined that he was going to stay on that reservation. And he did. And a lot of legal challenges. A neighbor in the town of Trumbull claimed that they owned a good portion of that quarter acre. They were going to expand their driveway and, take a big chunk of the reservation. And the chief was just dogged and just saved that reservation. And I don't know what would have happened if it wasn't for Chief Big Eagle. Anyway, after Chief Big Eagle, he turned the chieftainship over to his son, Chief Quiet Hawk. And I should backtrack a second and say it's remarkable that the tribe can trace their leadership back unbroken all the way to that year of 1639. We know who was chief during every period. There were no breaks at all. And some remarkable people just keeping those traditions alive, making sure the younger generation knew who they were, knew what tribal traditions were important, knew about the land, knew what land had been theirs and what sites were important. So that's a pretty remarkable thing. Chief Quiet Hawk, as I mentioned, passed away, I think it was April 27th of this year. And I don't know who is going to be the new chief of the tribe, but I'm sure there will be one, and I'm sure the tradition will be kept. So anyway.
Yes, of course. Now, of course, the Paugussets have existed and will continue to exist. I'm wondering how have they traced their traditions? They have this wonderful line of chiefs, as you mentioned. What actions are they taking, or have they taken in the past to preserve this wonderful culture?
Well, I should mention Chiefess Rising Star. She was William Sherman's granddaughter, born in the year 1893, and she lived to be over 100 years old. And I looked at a lot of tribal oral histories that were compiled 20, 30 years ago, and she was someone that was known all over Bridgeport and the lower Naugatuck Valley as riding on public buses, and she was somebody who stood out because she would wear a deerskin dress and beaded moccasins and a beaded handbag, and she was the Indian lady that everybody in town knew. And she had made some money, as did Mary Freeman before her, investing in real estate in the north end of Bridgeport. And during the Depression, she would go from tribal members' household to household, helping people out financially. And she was just the one who kept everything together, kept all those traditions. See that in the Mohegan tribe. There was a lady by the name of Gladys Tantaquidgeon. She had a little museum building, and just anything that anyone had that was important to the tribe, she preserved. And Chiefess Rising Star was the same sort of individual with the Paugussets. And she's the one who passed down all these traditions to what are now the elder members of the tribe. And they are doing the same to the younger generations. They have powwows on the reservation starting up again in the 1970s, and those are continuing. And Chiefess Rising Star had to spend hours on the bus going from Bridgeport to Ansonia, let's say, to keep in touch with tribal members. And it's so much easier now with technology to keep things together, to keep things intact. Other than that, I think, I can't speak for the tribe. I live 450 miles away now. I'm not really involved with that, but I know there's a lot going on. Um, a tradition that's important to every member of the tribe is being kept alive. And, hopefully this whole question of federal recognition is going to be resolved. I know Chief Quiet Hawk, before he passed away, took care of a lot of things, and we will see what happens with that in the hopefully not too distant future.
Right, of course. Well, we do want to encourage our audience, if you have any questions for Charles, please do put them in the comments box. I do have one other question, Charles, and speaking for the museum, we are so hopeful that the tribe will continue with their traditions, and we're so hopeful that they will gain at least more recognition locally, if not federally, for the amazing history that they have that is so integral to Westport's history and also the rest of Southern Connecticut and the nation at large. We do hope that they, and fully expect that they remain a vibrant part of the culture in this area.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that they will.
Yes.
That reservation's not going anyplace. People are not leaving it by the wayside. It's something that's of huge importance to every member of that tribe.
Yeah. And I think of importance to at least everyone here at the museum, if not our larger community. And I do hope that through programs such as tonight, and hopefully more programs and partnerships with not only the Paugussets, but other tribal leaders in the state, that we can bring some larger focus to this fabulous history and this ongoing culture.
Yeah, Connecticut is so fortunate that the tribes have been preserved here. You go to other states, the whole state of Pennsylvania, for example, there are no recognized tribes. Mm-hmm. And whatever culture was there has pretty much been lost. Other states are, in the same boat. And Connecticut just started with a policy back in the 17th century that kept the fires burning. Mm-hmm. It wasn't a very good process, but it was better than nothing.
Right. Now, something else that I wanted to touch on again, Charles, was this idea of permission and oversight has come up again and again. Where did this come from? Where does this thinking on the part of either the local or federal governments that tribal people needed this oversight or this permission from either colonizers or later on American entities?
Yeah, it seems pretty amazing that this is the system that worked itself out. It just, when you read the overseers' reports, they're just treating Native Americans as incompetent children. And then when you look at people like the Freeman sisters, you realize that they were incredibly sharp people who knew how to handle themselves. You read William Sherman's diary. He was not some slothful person who, sat around with a bottle of whiskey all day. He's someone who worked 18 hours a day and mastered so many skills in addition to traditional skills like Indian medicine. And the white community around him in the village of Nichols relied on him as a medical doctor with all his herbal knowledge. So these were not stupid people. These were not lazy, incompetent people. But somehow the state always managed to require that they have this overseer. And it was just, like I said, a nice plum position for some friend of the government.
It's again, there are things in this history that seem surprising, but unfortunately are just kind of constants throughout history. It's frustrating.
There
but
was
I think important to learn about and to understand.
one tribal overseer. He was a pillar of the community. This is back in the 1890s, and he had control of the tribal fund. And he died one day, and there's a headline in the newspaper, "Pillar of the Community Passes Away." And his name was Roland B. Lacey. He was a founder of the Fairfield County Historical Society, did, all kinds of stuff like that. And a couple weeks after he died, there's another headline, "Discrepancies Found in Roland Lacey's Accounts." And it turned out he was a lawyer and had all these trust funds that people thought were being managed, and he had basically absconded with all the monies. There was a Staples Academy in Easton that all their money was gone and they had to go out of business. All kinds of widows and orphans and everybody, their funds were all gone. And that was the end of the Paugussett Tribal Fund. And when he died, I think the year was 1897, there were no more overseers until the whole change in the status of the Connecticut tribes in 1934. And 1934, there was a report, and it said, since the death of Roland B. Lacey, the tribe has basically managed their own affairs. So it took till the end of the 19th century, but they seem to have done all right.
Yes. It's very frustrating, but it's so frustrating. But we are so encouraged that they are in charge of themselves today. Again, there's still this.
You get the sense we're at the cusp of a major change in American society, and things that have so long gone unrecognized. The little Liberia community in Bridgeport, it was so important and so neglected, probably for reasons known to the white community in the old days. And that all seems to be changing. And up until a few years ago, the city was just trying to get those houses torn down. And, now we know these are the last of that type of house, and that, remnants of that type of community. Every place else in America, all this kind of stuff got wiped out by urban renewal.
Right.
And these are the last two that are left, incredibly important. And they have so much to teach us. And we're just, starting to learn about this community.
And I hope there's so much more that comes out. We fully expect more and more research to come out about this in the coming years. As you mentioned, Charles, so much has come out already, and we're so thrilled about the revitalization and all of the work and the reconstruction that is happening at the Freeman Center with the sisters.
Yeah, everywhere we look, there's Lewis Latimer, who developed the key to the incandescent light bulb. Thomas Edison's right-hand man lived in the little Liberia community, and nobody knew. And, so many other people of incredible importance. People that Frederick Douglass was good friends with. The minister who encouraged Frederick Douglass to become Frederick Douglass was also the minister of the church in Little Liberia.
Right. And we're so at the museum, we're so excited to hear more of those stories. I do want to thank you, of course, Charles. We are coming to the end of our program tonight, but I want to thank you for coming on and telling us more about the history of not only the Paugussett people, but their involvement in Bridgeport and, of course, of Little Liberia, which is all a part of their ongoing story that we're so excited to see the next chapter of.
Well, it's going to be an interesting one.
Of course. To our audience, if you are interested in learning more about the Paugussett history, we do, of course, encourage you to get a copy of A History of Connecticut's Golden Hill Paugussett Tribe by Charles. We encourage you to go to bookshop.org to support local booksellers. So I do want to thank you once again, Charles. This was fantastic. And we do hope to hear more in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And we, of course, want to thank all of you, to our audience, for supporting not only the museum and our programming, but, of course, supporting other programs of this type in the future. So thank you once again, everyone.